ceasefire between Iran and Israel.
Yeah, huge development.
Absolutely. After, what was it, 12 days of really dangerous, escalating conflict, the big question on everyone's mind isn't just if the fighting stopped.
No, it's much deeper than that.
Exactly. It's what actually went down in those incredibly tense moments. How did they even manage to forge this, well, fragile agreement? And maybe most importantly, is this just a pause, the calm before another storm? Or could it actually be a path to real peace?
That's the core issue, isn't it?
It is. So we've gone through a whole stack of analyses, diplomatic reports, classified ones even, expert geopolitical takes, major news coverage, basically trying to unpack all of that for you. So let's tackle that central question. After 12 days right on the edge, has this ceasefire genuinely paved the way for peace, or are we just waiting for the other shoe to drop?
Well, what our sources really suggest is that this isn't, it's not just a temporary pause in the fighting. It feels more like a strategic breath, you could say, for both Iran and Israel.
A strategic breath. Explain that.
Yeah, I mean, the immediate conflict stops, sure, but the underlying issues, that deep mistrust, the competing ambitions they both have in the region, those haven't gone anywhere.
Right.
In fact, the sources indicate they're actively reevaluating, planning their next moves. So it's really less about peace and maybe more about recalibrating these ongoing tensions.
Okay, recalibrating. That paints a different picture. That sense of widespread disruption you mentioned, that definitely comes through in the reports we looked at. To really get the ceasefire, we probably need to rewind to those 12 days. What did the sources tell us about just how intense that period was, beyond the headlines?
No, intense is almost an understatement. Our deep dive into these reports, it paints a really chilling picture. For nearly 2 weeks, the whole Middle East felt like he was on a razor's edge.
You could feel it globally, really.
Absolutely. Israel's airstrikes, for example, they weren't just scattered or random. The reports detail how they specifically targeted what Israel claimed were, Iranian-backed command centers, weapons depots, quite sophisticated ones, and even suspected missile sites deep in the region.
So a strategic campaign.
Exactly. It wasn't just tit-for-tat retaliation. It was a deliberate effort to degrade specific capabilities Iran or its proxies had. And then Iran's response. Their missile attacks. Some were intercepted, yes, but many aimed at Israeli population centers.
Like Beersheba?
Precisely. Deliberately escalating fear among civilians, triggering mass evacuations. The documentation we reviewed really emphasized this constant back and forth, this deliberate escalation from both sides. It made a bigger regional war seem not just possible, but maybe even likely.
Yeah.
Put millions of lives on hold, businesses closed, sirens blaring, just widespread alarm.
It sounds like it went beyond military targets then into sending these very dangerous messages, shaking up civilian life. So given how close things felt to blowing up, what were the absolute critical factors that pushed both sides towards even considering a ceasefire? Was it international pressure, internal stuff? What do the sources point to?
This is where that, behind-the-scenes diplomacy really becomes visible in the reports. The U.S. involvement was significant, really intense, actually.
Law diplomacy.
Robust shuttle diplomacy, yeah. Moving between Jerusalem and other capitals, carrying messages, demands. But also, Qatar played a really critical role.
Oh, as a back channel.
Exactly. They acted as this crucial facilitator, using their unique diplomatic connections with both Iran and Israel. The consensus among the analysts we read suggests it was this combination from the diplomatic pressure, mainly U.S. and Qatari, coupled with a growing realization on both sides, in Tehran and Jerusalem, that just continuing to escalate carried risks that were becoming unacceptable.
Too high a cost.
Too high a cost. And that ultimately led them to accept what's described consistently as phased ceasefire agreement. It wasn't like one side suddenly gave in. It was a very carefully managed step down.
Okay, phased ceasefire. That phrase itself, it suggests complexity, doesn't it? Not just stop shooting. Our listeners will want to know the mechanics. What did these phases actually involve? Why structure it that way?
Yeah, good question. The sources detail that it wasn't a simple on-off switch. Definitely not. It was highly structured, which really tells you about the deep lack of trust between them.
Makes sense.
So the initial phase, phase one, demanded an immediate total halt to all military attacks, all of them, within a really tight 24-hour window, basically stop the bleeding, right?
Okay, step one.
Then, after that, you had staggered withdrawals, pulling forces back from those immediate confrontation lines, getting some distance. Only after those steps were verifiably completed would they even begin to consider starting indirect talks about specific grievances.
So talking came much later.
Much later, and indirectly. This phased approach, our analysis really shows, it just reflects how deeply suspicious each side is of the other. Neither was willing to give up too much, too quickly, without seeing the other side make a concrete, verifiable move first. It was about building, maybe, the tiniest bit of fragile confidence step by step, under intense international watch, of course.
Okay, so less a peace deal, more a detailed de-escalation protocol, built on verification. What were the actual core conditions, the binding parts of this phased agreement? What did they explicitly agree to do, and maybe more importantly, not do? And where were the weak spots?
The terms were pretty precise,
Yeah.
Designed to stop the immediate fighting, but acknowledging that deep-seated hostility. So first, as we said, that 24-hour halt, absolutely paramount.
Right.
Then, this was really crucial, a clause stating that neither country would initiate the first attack after that initial halt. The idea was to break that cycle of escalation, tit for tat.
Okay, don't shoot first. Seems simple, but...
But, and this is a huge but, it wasn't some kind of blanket forgiveness. Not at all. Our analysis of the diplomatic messages highlights this very clearly. If a violation did happen, maybe an accidental border crossing, maybe a deliberate strike, the other party explicitly reserved the right to retaliate.
There's the catch.
That right to retaliate clause is critical. The sources flag it as both, well, a guarantee that the ceasefire would be taken seriously, but also a potential tripwire. A huge one.
Because one incident could unravel everything.
Precisely. It means even though the attack stopped, the immediate threat of attack didn't really go away. It's not peace based on trust or reconciliation. It's more like a tense standoff where any perceived mistake or deliberate provocation could legitimately restart the whole thing. The ceasefire is basically on probation, constantly.
Yeah.
Very little room for error.
Wow. That right to retaliate clause, it really does feel like a loaded gun sitting on the table, doesn't it? It keeps the pressure on, but the risk stays incredibly high. What about the immediate reactions? Officially, from Tehran and Jerusalem once this deal was locked in, were they relieved, defiant, something else?
It was interesting. The reports indicate Iran went notably silent after its last reported missile attack. Just quiet. Some analysts we read interpreted that as quite strategic. Avoid any further provocation, signal compliance without making a big show of it, let the ceasefire actually take hold.
The dust settle.
Exactly. On Israel's side, the official line, coming through official channels, was, "We have achieved our military objectives."
A declaration of success?
Sort of, but the expert assessments suggest it wasn't about claiming final victory. It was more like a calculated way to exit the immediate fighting. It suggested they felt they'd shown their capabilities, maybe deterred Iran from immediate further action, but it didn't really address the long-term strategic problems. So both sides, really in their own way, signaled they were stepping back for now, each with their own reasons.
Those reactions do give you a peek into their thinking, but as the sources make really clear, a conflict like this, it never happens in a vacuum, does it?
Yeah.
What were the wider ripples, especially for countries like India, who kind of found themselves caught in the middle?
India's position, that was remarkably consistent throughout this whole thing and very pragmatic. From the information we gathered, India kept appealing for peace and for autonomy.
Which means restraint.
It translates as restraint, yes, but it carries a slightly deeper cultural sense of self-control, deliberate, measured action, especially in a crisis. Their foreign ministry put out a statement explicitly calling for all parties to exercise restraint and find a solution through dialogue.
Standard diplomatic language, maybe?
Well, yes, but it wasn't just a general plea for world peace. It came from very specific, very practical concerns that were hitting close to home for India.
Okay. So India's stance wasn't just moral positioning. It was driven by concrete, economic, and humanitarian worries. What were those key vulnerabilities for India that made this ceasefire such a big deal for them?
Oh, hugely tangible concerns, directly impacting millions of Indians in the national economy. First off, the conflict was immediately pushing up global oil prices sharply.
And India imports a lot of oil.
Exactly, one of the world's biggest importers. So those price spikes, they translate almost instantly into higher inflation back home, higher energy costs, serious economic instability. For a developing economy like India's, that can have really damaging ripple effects. Transport, manufacturing, everything.
Okay, oil prices. What else?
Secondly, and maybe even more immediate, was the human element. There are millions, literally millions, of Indian expats living and working all across the Middle East.
Sending money home.
Vital remittances, yes. Supporting countless families back in India. Their safety, their well-being was directly threatened by the instability. There were real fears about potential evacuations or just disruption to those critical economic lifelines they represent.
I see.
So for India, this ceasefire wasn't just welcome news, it was a profound relief. It directly eased those very real anxieties. It really highlights how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? Regional conflicts have immediate, far-reaching global consequences.
A moment of global relief then, especially for India economically and for its citizens abroad.
Definitely. And speaking of global reactions, when the ceasefire was announced, there was this definite wave of, well, maybe cautious optimism.
Cautious is probably the right word.
Yeah. U.S. President Trump, for instance, he described it pretty hopefully as a permanent solution. But our sources highlight this really critical, stark detail from the very last moments of the fighting. What does that final incident tell us about the actual nature of this peace, especially when you contrast it with that optimism? Yeah, that raises a really important point about, the gap that often exists between the rhetoric around peace deals and the messy reality on the ground. While the hope might have been for something permanent, the details of what happened right at the end, they paint a much more complicated and frankly tragic picture.
What happened?
The report specifically mentioned that even as the ceasefire was being finalized, being announced, the very last acts of aggression included Iranian missiles targeting the Israeli city of Beersheba.
Right at the deadline.
Right up to it. And tragically, that final attack resulted in the deaths of 4 civilians, 4 people killed.
Oh, wow.
That specific detail, it's crucial because it just starkly underlines how fragile the whole situation was and still is.
Yeah.
It wasn't a clean stop, handshake, end of story. There was a real immediate human cost right up until the 11th hour. It really complicated that initial global sigh of relief. It highlighted that maybe not all actors were fully on board or under control.
That detail about Beersheba, 4 lives lost just as peace is supposedly taking hold. That's profoundly disturbing. What does that tell us about the immediate hurdles for this ceasefire, and how did that hit the global perception of success? It's just a gut punch, isn't it? A reminder that stopping the fighting doesn't erase the cost.
Exactly. That incident immediately cast a long shadow over the whole permanent solution idea. It tells us a few critical things, I think. First, it points to the potential, maybe, for rogue elements or hardliners on either side to act, even while their governments are talking peace.
Spoilers.
Could be. Second, it just highlights how incredibly difficult it is to perfectly synchronize a stop to fighting when you have so many different groups, weapons, and locations involved. For people watching around the world, it was this stark reminder that this peace, quote-unquote, wasn't born from any kind of trust or reconciliation. It came from a tense, tactical pause. No. It definitely shifted the perception away from clean breakthrough towards something far more precarious. It suggested the region is still fundamentally a powder keg, even with this agreement technically in place.
It certainly muddies the waters of any narrative about a clean break. So wrapping up this deep dive then, that really is the question the source material leaves us hanging with, isn't it? Is this ceasefire truly a meaningful step toward some kind of lasting peace in what is just an incredibly volatile part of the world? Or is it really just a temporary quiet, a lull before the conflict flares up again?
It forces you, I think, to consider the huge difference between just stopping the shooting, the cessation of hostilities, and actually resolving the underlying problems, or achieving genuine reconciliation.
Yeah.
The immediate silence, undeniably welcome. It provides a desperately needed break. But those deep-rooted factors that caused those 12 days of fighting in the first place, the proxy conflicts, the ideological clashes, the struggle for regional power, and just that profound lack of basic trust, none of that has disappeared.
Still there.
It's all still there. The sources really seem to suggest this is less about solving the problem and much more about pausing it, managing the symptoms maybe, rather than curing the disease itself.
That's the core challenge, isn't it? That constant